Hi everyone, welcome back to another video, and today I'm addressing something that was mentioned a lot in my comment section on my ivermectin video. So a lot of people have been saying, why don't you trust the anecdotes of doctors? I mean, they are the experts, we should just take their word for it, right? And there are many reasons why I don't think this is a good idea. Anecdotes are not data. This is something that I've said multiple times. Many other skeptical YouTubers have said the same thing before, and that is that anecdotes are not data. And I'm going to talk today about why I don't trust anecdotes and kind of explain why these aren't trustworthy sources of information and why we need more study on things like ivermectin. So today we're going to cover this from kind of a different angle than a lot of other people. When a lot of people talk about being able to trust anecdotes, a lot of times they're coming from the standpoint of, are people being dishonest, or are people not remembering things correctly? And this is a good way to approach it a lot of the times, because I mean, a very legitimate concern of anecdotes is that you don't know necessarily if someone is being honest with you. They might be lying to you. Like if you were to walk up to me and say that you had $1 million in cash in your pocket, I might be kind of hesitant to believe you because it's possible that you're lying. People lie. It's a thing that happens. So that is a risk and a reason why anecdotes are not really trustworthy without evidence to back them up. And then also just even if someone is being honest, but just human cognition and human memory is not perfect. So the more times we think back on something, the more likely it is that our side of the story has changed since then. We don't remember every single detail. And so while a person might be completely honest in what they remember, it might not be accurate in lining up with what actually happened. So I'm not going to cover those two specific reasons today because this is a science channel. So we're going to cover basically my debunk of anecdotes with variables, because I think a lot of this comes down to variables and what variables are in the equation and how they kind of mess things up. So I know it's been a long time for a lot of us studying the scientific method, but we're going to use this video and other videos down the line to address the scientific method and kind of go over its components again so we can remember what makes a good study, what makes something evidence that I would be ready to believe in, and what makes a study kind of not very good to read, what makes a study less convincing to me. And today we're just going to focus on variables. So going back to the very basics, we have a few different variables that happen in a study. And the first variable is the independent variable. And this is what we control in the study. So the independent variable, let's say we're having a study on whether or not ivermectin is effective for treating COVID. So in this case, the independent variable is giving ivermectin. So you'd have one group that has ivermectin and one group that does not have ivermectin. And this is the independent variable because we are choosing which groups get ivermectin, which ones don't. We are deciding that this is a factor that we are controlling. We have power over who gets ivermectin and who doesn't. So this is the independent variable. Next is the dependent variable, and the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. So this is what we are studying. So if we are trying to prove a causal relationship between ivermectin and people surviving COVID or having better outcomes for COVID, the dependent variable is going to be those outcomes, because we don't know what those outcomes are. We can't control the outcomes. We can control the ivermectin or not the ivermectin, but we must depend on the ivermectin or lack of ivermectin to give us the study result. So this is our dependent variable. And then, of course, there are lots of other factors that play into a study. You're not going to have an isolated scenario. People are different, like especially in a clinical trial. You have people of different backgrounds, different health issues, different age groups. And we need to control these as much as possible, which is why we have something called the controls. So these are factors that we need to keep constant across the study groups. Because, of course, if you have people of different ages, let's say you have people who are over the age of 65 in one group, and then you have In the other group, you only have people under the age of 24. You're going to get very different study results, and it might skew what your results say, because your results might say that there's a significant difference. But if you look at the design, you didn't control for that. So what if age was a factor? What if things like sun exposure, if you walk out in the sun, or if you have a smoking history, if you have family history of diabetes, or things like that that you need to control for, you need to make sure are not messing with these other two variables. So we try to keep these as constant as possible. But it's not a perfect system a lot of the time. And especially when you have an anecdote, you're not controlling for these factors. You're just going off of your own experience, of your own story. And when you're telling a story, when you're going about your day-to-day life, you're not controlling for these variables. You're not keeping everything constant. And so what happens when we don't keep these controlled? We get something that is called a confounding variable. And this is where a separate variable besides the independent variable and the dependent variable contribute to the study result, and it can skew your data. So I'm going to give a little hypothetical example, and we're going to use ivermectin because this is kind of the popular thing that's being talked about. So we have two doctors. We have Dr. A and Dr. B. Dr. A prescribes ivermectin for COVID, and we're going just based on anecdotes, so just what these doctors have told us. And this isn't a study necessarily, this is just going off of their clinical experience. So Dr. A prescribes ivermectin for COVID, Dr. B does not prescribe ivermectin. So that's why we have a plus IVM and a minus IVM. So let's look at Dr. A for a second. So Dr. A prescribes ivermectin, but he works in a very small clinic, and a lot of his patients are kind of on the younger side. They're more healthy. It's an outpatient clinic, so people come to him for primary care type things, and he's only seen 3 COVID patients. And there have been no comorbidities, so his patients don't have autoimmune conditions, they don't have immunodeficiencies, no like diabetes, no conditions that would put them at increased risk for complications from COVID. So really, these people that have been getting COVID, they've been able to probably get treated at home. They probably haven't needed to be admitted to the hospital. Right? Okay, so very low acuity cases. So Dr. A has 0 deaths and 0 complications. Okay, so this is the first scenario. Let's look at Dr. B. So Dr. B does not prescribe ivermectin, but Dr. B works in an ICU. He is a pulmonologist and a critical care physician, and he has had 40 COVID patients. And all of his patients have a lot of comorbidities. So they're probably older, they might have diabetes, they might have immunosuppression, they might have cancer, they might have anything, and they are more likely to obviously be in the hospital because Dr. B only sees ICU patients. So all of his patients are critical compared to Dr. A, who Dr. A only has patients that are outpatient and who don't need to be in the ICU. So Dr. B has 40 COVID cases in the ICU, lots of comorbidities. He has had 10 deaths and 20 complications out of those 40 COVID patients. Okay, so what does it look like here? It looks like that ivermectin caused there to be 0 deaths and 0 complications, and for these COVID cases to be okay and resolve. But then you compare that with Dr. B, yeah, he has a lot of deaths and a lot of complications, and he didn't use ivermectin. So was it the ivermectin in this case that made the difference? Probably not. Probably not, because we have very different situations. We have more healthy patients over here, and of course, they might have resolved their cases anyway. And think about it this way. When you have a disease, there are only 2 outcomes. And because it has to resolve somehow. Either you die or you live. And if you live, you might have some complications, or you might not have complications, but you live or you die. It's going to resolve somehow. And like for Dr. A's, like a lot of them happen to live. Dr. B's, a lot of them happen to die. And as you can see, we have multiple factors that play into that. It could be age, it could be acuity, it could be comorbidities, it could be any number of those things. But you cannot tell at all if ivermectin played a role at all in that. So when somebody tells me, well, this doctor told me that they had 0 COVID deaths and they were giving out ivermectin, this is why I don't really believe them, because they might be a Dr. A, where they don't really have COVID patients. So of course they're not going to have a lot of deaths. So that's kind of why this isn't really convincing for me. But something else I did want to address before we end this video is that it's kind of odd, like when people say that ivermectin improves COVID cases, like you get an improvement. That's really vague, and it doesn't tell me a lot about what was going on, right? Because what is improvement? How do we define improvement? You need to have a goal for what this therapy is doing. So when we are defining improvement, do we mean that there are decreased deaths, so a reduced morbidity and mortality? Are we saying reduced hospitalizations or reduced readmissions? So people who were discharged and then readmitted because they got sick again? Is that what we're talking about when we're saying improvement? Are we saying decreased long-term effects of COVID? Are we saying decreased reinfections with COVID? So there are plenty of things here that we could define as being improvement. But when someone says ivermectin has greater improvement with COVID cases compared to, say, azithromycin or things, what do they mean by that? What specifically do they mean by improvement? Because just saying improvement does not tell me anything about exactly what the drug is doing. And this leads into, there needs to be a goal of therapy. If we're going to use a medication, let's say we're giving somebody oxygen. We give somebody oxygen because it decreases morbidity and mortality. And that is a measurable goal. That is a measurable therapeutic benefit, is that it decreases morbidity and mortality. We don't ever say that something just improves conditions or like reduces complications. Like it's you have to be specific. You have to be specific on that. So that's pretty much where I'm leaving this video. I hope you liked it. We're going to cover more videos down the line about the scientific method, so stay tuned. You can leave hate comments if you want. I don't really care, but I hope you understand a little bit more now, and I will see you all in the next one.